So glad that you are here, especially that you stayed after Kenny told you I was speaking. I'm so touched by that. Pastor Chris will be back next week, so just hang on, get through today. You know, I absolutely loved squash at one time in my life. Absolutely loved it until one day I didn't. And something happened that just turned my stomach and I couldn't eat it anymore. And that was a sad day. And I realized, contemplating on that the reason that I quit liking squash and eating squash is the same reason some people taste Christianity and don't want any part of it. So what did they do to my squash? I'm glad you asked, and I'm going to tell you about that in just a minute. Living in this region, I know that you're aware of this decal that you see usually flying up and down 431 on the back of a car, people crazy getting to the beach, and it's called Salt Life. How many have seen that? Everybody. And so Salt Life is a company. It's not just a decal. It was started by four friends who absolutely loved water sports and all things centered around the ocean. And so they started a company, a brand, that was for those people that also like to have an ocean-centric life, people that loved not only water sports, but also loved the ocean and how to care for the ocean and how to take care of the sea life. And so it became a whole culture behind, well, the culture before the brand. And so now they've got decals and they've got hats and they've got T-shirts, and that's just for men. Of course, the women, they have hats and they have T-shirts, but the women have accessories. You right? Women have to have accessories. So you can get bottle holders, you can get cup holders, all this stuff, all surrounding Salt Life. But you know, the question that came to my mind is I wonder how many people that have the decal, that have the T-shirt, that have the hat, even know the story behind the decal. How many know the story behind the logo? How many know what it's all about? That it is a lifestyle. In fact, the owners, the founders, and the core group that make the thing run, their whole life is centered around ocean things. They love it. That's their next adventure. They spend all their time thinking about the next time to get to the ocean. And they wanted people to understand the culture behind the brand. If you go to their website, it's a fabulous website, very colorful, and they've done a great job with this whole thing. But it also made me think about the Christian life. That we have the same kind of issues sometimes. We have people that are Christians, they're religious, and they have the decals, and they have the bumper stickers, and they have the Jesus gear. You know, you can get that at Christian bookstores, Jesus gear. Cups, crosses, necklaces, placemats, pictures, just all kinds of stuff. And hey, you know what? And I'm not knocking that. That's great. Go buy it. Buy it up. But you know, if that's what you do and you don't realize there's a lifestyle behind the brand, all the Jesus gear is not going to do you any good, and it's not going to do this world any good. It's like the person that pulled up behind a car at a red light, and the bumper sticker said, "Honk if you love Jesus." So they honked, and no one did anything. They honked again, and finally the person jumped out of the car and just began to swear and said, "What in the world are you doing? The light's red." And he said, "Well, said honk if you love Jesus." And they looked and said, "Oh, I borrowed the car." You know, so they missed the whole point. And yet, sad, really sad, is when you realize that there are actually Christians that didn't borrow the car, and they still have that reaction when push comes to shove. So, at any rate, Jesus had this idea of Salt Life way before these four friends did a few years ago in Jacksonville, Florida. And he was about us living the original Salt Life. Go beyond the deeds, go beyond the decals, go beyond the Jesus gear, and discover the lifestyle. Pastor Chris started the series last week, and he talked about the first part of chapter 5 of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus, and by the way, Jesus didn't call, I think I'll call this Sermon on the Mount. We call it that. He just began to teach people what it was like to live the kind of life that God blesses, the kind of life that God approves of. I mean, religion is all about trying to be religious, and for ages and for thousands of years, people have tried to know what it was like to get on God's good graces. And Jesus said, here's what it means. Don't do the deeds first, do the person first. Get on the lifestyle page first. Get the attitudes in place first. Have the right attitude of humility and meekness, and mourn over your sin, and take responsibility of your sin, and don't blame others. Own it and get through it, and get on the other side of that, and be merciful to those who need mercy. Be compassionate to those that need compassion, and be this kind of person before you start doing the checklist of I went to church, I bought the Bible, I've got the family Bible on my coffee table, hadn't opened it, but it's there. I dust it. Hadn't read it, but I dust it. I don't want anybody messing with it because my grandma handed it down to us. Great, that's great. But does it do anything for your life? That's the whole point. Jesus was saying, get the attitude in gear, and all these things will flow from that in a natural way. He was very clear about what he wanted his followers to be and what he wanted them to be about, what he wanted them to be doing. And then he makes a statement and challenge that we've gotten several everyday sayings from. How many of you have ever heard of this statement? A person is really good and we call them the salt of the earth. He's the salt of the earth kind of guy. Anybody ever heard that? How many of you know a salt of the earth kind of person? How many of you think you're that person? Don't answer that. We've heard that statement, and it came right out of Jesus' words. How about this one? A person that's not good at what they do, and they're not diligent in doing it, and we say that they're not worth their... Have you guys never heard these things? The expression of somebody being worth their salt actually happened in, it's derived mostly from ancient Rome. And when soldiers, it's alleged that they got paid sometime in salt. Salt was a highly valuable commodity in that world today. It wasn't like today where we have so much of it and it's so inexpensive. It was hard to get back in that day, so that made it a very treasured commodity. And soldiers oftentimes were given an allowance just to buy salt. In fact, the word salt comes from a Latin word that the Romans used called salarium, which meant we get the word salary from. And so they were given an allowance to buy salt. Salt was very important in that world for lots of different reasons. And so Jesus takes this word and he gives us this verse in Matthew. He says, you are the salt of the earth, but what good is salt if it's lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? And he wasn't literally looking for an answer to those questions. He's kind of making a statement that, and he said it will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless. Salt had so many different uses in the ancient world, just as it does today. In the ancient world, it was used a lot for cleansing and purifying that's infected. Cleansing and purifying that's infected. We still use salt for that reason today in a lot of ways. I can remember growing up on the beach, how if you got out in the beach in the salt water, a lot of times it would clear up acne. The salt had an effect on that, cleanse a wound, and that kind of thing. Yeah, it can burn it too, but it has a healing, a cleansing, and a purifying effect. And so that was the idea behind this. The Romans felt like that salt was the purest of all things because it was from the sea and from the sun. Salt was often offered to the gods as an offering of all the pagan rituals. But salt water in itself, how many of you have ever had a sore throat and you gargled with salt water? Salt cleanses and it purifies that's infected. And in that way, Jesus was saying to us that, we that bear his light, we that follow him and seek to mirror his life, that we should have a cleansing and a purifying effect on the world in which we live. And that doesn't mean we're going around like, some Christians go around like a bottle of, any of you remember this medicine called methylate? Woo, baby, that stuff, when you put that on a wound, it's all over but the shouting. That stuff burned. I remember I'd rather do anything than get that put on a wound. And so some Christians have that effect, but that's not the point of the cleansing, purifying effect of salt. It's to cleanse and to make healthy that is infected, and we should have that kind of effect in our world. And Jesus goes on, and he's saying the salt of the earth. I think he's probably applying it also to the fact that salt in the ancient world in which he lived preserved the good and the healthy. It kept things from going bad. But For those of us that grew up with refrigeration, believe it or not, there was a time where there was no refrigerators. You just didn't go to the fridge and get a soda or go get some ice or whatever. You couldn't put food in the fridge to last a year, and whenever you got ready to cook it, or the freezer, the way they kept food alive was to soak it in salt, to put meat and pack and rub the salt into the meat so that it wouldn't spoil. And this was just very common in the day. And it also salt represented power, because without salt, armies couldn't travel great distances because they couldn't keep their food from spoiling. Explorers couldn't sail very far because their goods would spoil without salt. And Jesus was saying that his followers, with the right attitudes that Chris talked about last week, can help turn the world from corruption. It can save the world from corruption. We'd have a certain antiseptic influence on life to keep it from spoiling and going bad. But you know what? Just like salt couldn't preserve meat in the day without it being rubbed into the meat, you and I, as the salt of the earth, we can't have a preserving effect on our society unless we're close to that society. Now, there's I grew up in the teaching in Christianity to stay away from the world, it's evil, and so we stay way away, and we get in our little holy huddles, our Christian bubbles, and then we hope that the world will come jump in just think if you went out in one of these bass tournaments in Lake Eufaula, and you took that approach to fishing, that you just drive your boat out there, and you're just waiting for them to want to jump in your boat. Silly, right? And yet we get in our churches, in our Christian experiences, and we love it and we feel good and that was a great worship service today. Well, that really isn't a measure of our Christianity. The measure of our Christianity is what we do when we are poured out of the salt shaker and rubbed into the world. Do we preserve it? Do we help it become more healthy? Do we have a preserving effect? And to do that, we can't just be a light in the building. We have to be a light and a salt out in the world wherever we go. And you're in that world every day, 6 days out of the 7, 7 days out of the 7. You and I are in that world. So how are we preserving the world in which we live? How are we purifying and cleansing the world in which we live? Now, that doesn't mean that we have to clean up the world before we bring them to church, okay? How many know that? Are we on the same page here this morning? Okay. Let me ask it this way. Do you know some people in whose company it's easy to be good? That when you're around them, you just want to be good? Not because they're preachy and because they're condescending, because they're legalistic and they're pointing a finger at you and you're scared to death. That doesn't work. Because the minute you're out of their presence, you're going to live like crazy. Right? So what I'm talking about is, some people that they are just genuinely salt of the earth people, and when you're around them, you just feel elevated. You leave there wanting to be I've got some friends like that, and I'm around them, I often tell them, when I grow up, I want to be like you. Because when I'm around you, I feel I'm a better man. When I'm around you, my conversation is better. When I'm around you, my thoughts are better. And it's not because they're preaching to me, it's just who they are. They are salt to me. And that's the way we should be when we go out in the world. How many of you on the reverse side of that know some people that when you're around them, it does the opposite effect with you? That when you're around them, it brings you down. It makes you want to relax your standards. It makes you not want to be as good a person as you would really in your heart like to be. Anybody have friends like that, or acquaintances like that, or family members like that? It's okay, I'm not going to tell them. Salt was such a big deal in the ancient world, and it still is. In fact, there's over 14,000 uses for salt today, and I can't tell you 10, but there's 14,000. Our body needs it to function properly, right? And it's utilized in everything from producing chemicals to de-icing roads. Jesus projected that his committed followers, those who became the right kind of people, would be a purifying and preserving influence on the world, starting with the 8 attitudes that Jesus and Chris, using them interchangeably, Chris talked about last week, that Jesus said 2,000 years ago. Be sure to tell him I compared him to Jesus, okay? In a world that is naturally decaying in values and practices, and I think we could all pretty much agree on that, Jesus said his followers were to be pure in heart. that what you say is what you mean. Pure in our speech, pure in our motives. His followers would be those who held themselves accountable to standards of honesty and diligence in their work. They're the best workers in the marketplace. They're conscientious. They would influence those around them by their attitudes and their actions, not by leaving tracts that says turn or burn, or these kind of sly things that we try to do to influence the world. The best way we can influence them is to be the salt and be the light. But there's a quality of salt that I think Jesus also had in mind when he said that you or I are to be the salt of the earth. And that's this one: salt adds flavor to life. How many are glad we have salt and salt shakers? Isn't that great? And that leads me back to what they did to my squash. I was in the hospital as a college student, and I grew up loving squash. And one day they brought my meal. I was in the hospital, and I already wasn't feeling really good. And I didn't even realize it was squash. It didn't have the color that squash was supposed to have. And I tasted it, and it tasted, hospitals are known for their zesty cuisine, right? Right. Very bland hospital food. And so the taste and my unsettled condition and the color just turned my stomach sour. And I couldn't bring myself to eat it for years. Now, the good news is I got past that. I worked my way back just like an addict in recovery. I just a step at a time. And I got to the place I could eat squash again, stewed or boiled or walked or, stir-fried or whatever. And that was really good. But the reason it turned me off is because I was, good food is not only appetizing to the taste, it's also appetizing to the sight. You look at it and you get excited. How many, sitting at home and you're trying to be on a diet and some hamburger commercial comes on with this big, fat, juicy burger with cheese and, fresh tomatoes and all this stuff and a stack of fries big as Dallas, not Dallas, Canada, big as Dallas, Texas. Sorry, Dallas. And you look at that, and just the appearance makes your mouth water. And then you dive into it, and it's just like you pictured it. And how disappointing, though, when you're ready to dive into it. First of all, it doesn't look that great, and when you dive into it, it's even worse. And, that's, to me, one of the things that happens in our modern world in Christianity is that there's a lot of people, it's not that they haven't tried it, it's that they tried it, and it was so bland, and it was so disappointing. And it wasn't because of Jesus. It was because of us, his followers, that have forgotten to be the salt of the earth. The good news is that it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to be desalted or unsalted Christians or flavorless Christians. Just as unseasoned food is bland and insipid and even sickening to some, so are those who sport the name of Christ and lack the content of the name. Just like the people that buy the decal of Salt Life, but they don't really appreciate the culture behind the brand. They don't really appreciate the ocean and its pureness. They don't think about keeping it from pollution. They don't think about cleaning up after themselves when they go to the beach. Christ followers should lend flavor to life. And why do you think people invited Jesus to weddings and parties? If you read the Gospels, he was invited to all these happening things. Wedding celebration, a tax collector's party, which was like the most rowdy gathering in the community, and they invited him. Do you think they invited him because they needed a chaplain at those parties? No, I think they invited him because Jesus was the real deal. He added flavor. He added zest. He added life to the thing. People enjoyed being him. Let me ask you, do you invite people to your parties that you don't like, and people at your parties that's going to be Debbie Downers the whole time? Do you? If you can help it. I know some of you are related to them and it's inevitable, but do you actually do that if you had a choice? No, you wouldn't. So why do you think these party people would invite Jesus to their parties? Not because he was this party animal, but because he was so salty and he was so brilliant and he was so radiant and he was engaging and he didn't condemn and he showed compassion and he accepted those that were far from him. He accepted those that didn't act like him. He accepted those who didn't look like him. And they invited him. Now I ask you, does that describe us in our community? You know, after Constantine declared Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire, and that was a big thing because they'd been persecuted, Christians had been killed for their faith. Well, years and years later, there was another emperor that followed up, and there's a play written about him that gives him, that purports that he said that Christians, by the time he became emperor, had become insipid and flavorless, and they had took the vividness out of life. That's really a sad condition, isn't it? And in fact, more recent history, American judge Oliver Wendell Holmes once said that, he said, I might have entered the ministry as certain clergymen I knew had not looked and acted so much like undertakers. Oh, sad. Good grief. What happened? What happened in all of this, in all these transitions? Jesus wanted his followers to rediscover the salt life, a radiance of reflecting him in their everyday, ordinary lives. For instance, in a worried world, he wants his followers to show hope and not more worry. That's being salt. He wants his followers in a depressed world to show hope and peace. In a materialistic world, he hopes his followers shows a level of contentment that's countercultural to our hedonistic, materialistic world. And they learn contentment. In our approach to pleasure, he'd want his followers to be salt that can enjoy life and have pleasure, but pleasure without regret. And how do we approach ethics? I had a discussion recently with a guy, and we were talking about ethics, and this term, it's kind of an oxymoron in a way. It's about Christian ethics. There is no Christian ethics. You either have ethics or you don't, right? And yet, in the world, they have a pseudo form of ethics, and so Christians, do our ethics reflect purity, or is it the ethics of the world that can change depending on how much money is on the line? So it's very important. What about our judgment of others and our compassion toward those that are not only broken but are so different from ourselves? Is our compassion stronger, or is it more limited than people that don't even know Jesus? Do I add the right seasoning wherever I go in life this week? My role is not to be against this world. My role is to enrich and purify the world in which I live and to be a blessing to those around. Jesus intends his followers to be salt, not by being and providing not by wearing decals and caps, and nothing wrong with that, but he wants us to live the salt life by providing God-enhanced seasoning to our world by our very presence in the world and by our words. They're seasoned. Paul talked about our words being seasoned with grace. Another thing that salt does that Jesus was, I think, thinking about was salt creates a thirst. Too much salt can dehydrate us. It can cause high blood pressure. And I know some religious people that, and you probably do too, that when it comes to being the salt of the world, they take the lid off the salt shaker. Any of you ever been to a restaurant where some, body before you thought it would be really funny to loosen the top on a salt shaker until it would, if you turned it, it fell off? Don't try this, young people. It's really not fun for the people behind you. And you pick up the salt shaker and then you just pile all that salt on your food. I had a friend one time, we talked about it. He was an all gung-ho guy. Before he met Christ, he was gung-ho and a crazy guy. When he met Christ, he just continued that. And I told him, I said, man, you might want to just, put a dash of salt here and a dash of salt there instead of just taking the lid off the salt shaker and pouring it out. It'll dry you out. It'll dehydrate you. It'll give you high blood pressure, but the right amount of salt, the right amount of seasoning can create a thirst where people want more. And too often we try so hard to convert people to our way of thinking rather than to connect them to Jesus. And what I've learned is that the more we connect them to Jesus, the more their thinking gets straightened out, the more their behavior gets straightened out. And I realized that wasn't my job description to begin with. My job description was to be salt and create a thirst, to be light and create color. My job is to be a reflection of Jesus and not take the top off of the salt shaker. Following Jesus will shape our beliefs and our behaviors. You've heard the saying, haven't you, that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink it. And I remember in West Texas one time, a rancher told me, he said, no, that's very true, but you know what? You can put salt in its oats and make him thirsty. And I never forgot that because I thought, our job in this world is to salt some oats with just enough to make someone thirsty about the life that hopefully we found in Jesus Christ. And then the last thing about salt is it can de-ice. So those of you that's lived up north are very familiar with that. Ice hits the road, you put salt on it, melts it and all that. It wreaks havoc on the bottom of your car, but it does make driving a little more easy. And I found that there's a parallel to that even in our life as Christians. I have known people that were very anti-God, had relationships with them that were agnostic or atheistic and bitter toward God. And I realized that, arguing with them was only going to solidify both of us in what we already believed. But I also have witnessed, thankfully, that when I would just sprinkle salt, that hardness, that frozenness of brokenness in their life, that frozen, the things that had frozen them with fear and bitterness and all the things that life throws at them, over time, just the right amount of salt began to melt those hard edges and to melt that frozen pain in their life. And pretty soon, they were more engaging and wanting to talk more about God and His love and His acceptance of them. And it's not it's going to always happen, but it's better to give that a try than not at all. Jesus wrapped up this segment and He gave one other analogy, and I'm not going to spend time on it, so you can relax. But He also said in verse 13 through 16, He said, "You are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your Heavenly Father." It's interesting that He goes from talking about being a light to good deeds, and we kind of miss the connection. And yet it's really clear that the only way people are going to know and see the light of Jesus through us is through our good deeds. We're not going to leave here today and put this church face on, go everywhere, Jesus will make you happy and all this stuff. And, how long does that last? Till you get the bill you weren't expecting in the mail tomorrow, until you have crosswords with your mate this evening, and till you realize tomorrow is Monday and you got to go back to that job that you hate with a passion. All these things happen in life. They come at us. And so if we're going around thinking that our light is going to shine because we've been in the Holy of Holies for an hour this morning, and we go and we think we're going to look like Moses when he came down off the mountain and his face glowed. I've met very few Christians that I witnessed that with. Now, we should glow with a kindness and a love and a compassion and all that. But you know what's going to really brighten the light for people to see is when we serve them in the heart and in the name of Jesus Christ, and we serve them with the compassion with which Jesus loved us. The good deeds. Good deeds won't save you, but they should just emanate from a person that has been saved by the grace and glory of God. And people will see those good works, and we don't do it in our name. We do it for no recognition at all. And if we don't get recognized, we don't quit serving. But we just keep serving and we keep doing good deeds so people can say, man, God must really be good for those people to be doing that for me. That's the whole point. Jesus, notice He didn't say we are spotlights. You ever stepped in the spotlight? Can't see, like if they turn the lights off and all we have are spotlights on here, I can't see anybody I'm talking to. And some Sundays that's okay. When I see them falling asleep, or whatever. The spotlights blind you. And Jesus didn't say be a spotlight that you blind people where they can't see anything. He said be a light. A light on the hill, the city on the hill, was to guide people and help people find that place of refuge. And a lamp in the home was not to be hidden. It was supposed to give illumination so people could get around in the house. Everybody lived in that day in a one-room house and get around the house without stumbling over each other. It was to guide and to guide to safety. And it's interesting, Jesus did not call us to curse the darkness, but to light a candle. Not to curse the darkness, just light a candle. One secular business writer that I don't even know if he has a relationship with God or not, but he made a statement. He said, he's talking to entrepreneurs, and he said, don't be a student, be a practitioner. And I really liked that because I think sometime in church we can become students of the Bible. And what you're not hearing me say is that the Bible isn't important, okay? Just so we're clear. But some churches, they're all about being students of the Bible, and then they leave that in the church when they leave, and they're not practitioners of the greatest news ever given to man. And for us as a church, it's a challenge for me. There's days I don't want to be kind. There's days I don't want to be loving. There's people I don't want to be compassionate to. There's people that don't laugh at what I laugh at. There's people that don't vote like I vote. There's people that are just a lot more annoying than me. So it's just not automatic. But as I shared a few weeks ago, which you may or may not remember, I just stuck to this statement: is I can't always do it. I can't always be the salt and light that I want to, but He can, and He can through me. He can help me be the light. He can help me be the salt. And I have to be honest with myself when I am not having that preserving effect on my society, on my neighborhood, on my relationships. And as we leave today as a church, here's what I'm convinced of. We at SouthPoint, in this little city of Eufaula, begin to be the salt and light and play it out like this, that we begin to love people and serve people the way Jesus would love them and serve them if He lived in Eufaula. We would have to lock the doors on Sunday morning to keep us from violating the fire code. So many people would be coming to find out what's going on with the people, not in this building, but when they leave this building and go out into the community. You wouldn't hear about Christians and churchgoers that are good on Sunday, but they cheat you on Monday. And they don't deal ethically in business. You wouldn't hear about that. If we left this room, every church left the room this week and said, we're salt and we're light. The question is has our salt lost its flavor? And is our light hidden? Neither of which does the world any good. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you so much for your words, your challenging words. Thank you, Jesus, for setting the example for us and calling us to a higher life, to the salt life. Now, Lord, there's no way that we can fulfill it all. We try to do checklists, and it doesn't always work. Help us to remember, Lord, it starts in the heart, and even though we can't always be who we want to be on our own, we can through you, that you can enable us to become more and more like Christ. And Lord, may it be so as we leave here today that we would be salt to those people we meet in the restaurant, to the people that we interact with this afternoon, tomorrow, the new clients that we engage with in business, that there would be something about us that would be refreshing and engaging and uplifting and flavorful and preserving and enlightening. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.